Objective markers are a fascinating little part of the hobby. 25mm tokens to fight over, stand on, and die for. Or at least, that's what a little plastic men will be doing. Making these little markers will earn you a square on the hobby bingo. But I rarely see any discussion about them. So here we go. I'm Joe from Windrush Wargamers, and I want to talk to you about objective markers for Middle-earth SBG. Objective markers are not unique to SBG. They're used in many game systems. For instance, here are my objective markers for my Sisters of Battle, made from spare parts of the sprue to make artifacts and spare cherubs. For SBG, I don't really consider my armies finished unless I've completed a selection of theme-appropriate objective markers, which means I barely finish any of my armies. Sometimes it's just hard to find the time after finishing an army to really focus on objective markers, and for SBG, there isn't really much guidance or inspiration for making objective markers. The descriptions in the books are minimal at best. This tiny paragraph in the rulebook is all we're really left with. So we're pretty much left to our own devices to figure out what we need to use as objective markers. This could be something as simple as a fallen comrade. This is an old go-to of the hobby. Sticking a casualty to a 25mm base makes sense thematically. Now, in the narrative of the battle, your troops aren't just standing next to a disc on the floor, they're administering first aid, or protecting someone from further punishment. And there's a load of casualties to choose from in the game that are really easily accessible. You can find hurt elves in the Rivendell Knights kit, squished orcs in the Ent kit, or a plethora in the Middle-earth Casualties set, if you happen to be able to find it on eBay. Alternatively, you can make use of Elendil and Isildur, the Riders of Rohan from the Mummock base, Fallen Dwarves from the Watcher in the Water base, the Unfortunate Wounded Rangers of the Warg Chieftain, and Mounted Gothmog, just to name a few. Another way to make objective markers could be something important to your faction from the books or the films. Take the objective markers I use for Thranduil's Halls, for instance. When Thorin's company arrive, they see a statue of an elven lady. This happens to be Thranduil's late wife. The statue is overgrown with vines and stained with the red eye of Sauron. This acts as a metaphor for the corruption that's taken hold of Mirkwood. I wanted to use this as an objective marker, so I converted an old Galadriel miniature, complete with foliage wrapped around her. Even though I've since used her as part of my Mirkwood terrain, I think she could still work as an objective marker as long as everyone was happy with where she's placed. See the card above for how I made the Mirkwood terrain. Another symbol of the forest is the white stag that Bilbo and Thorin see when they're tripping balls. This was a simple 3D print I bought and painted. One question that might be helpful when determining what to use as an objective marker is, what does the faction value? Because each faction has their own motivations. Now, value might be items of rarity or power, so things like the Palantiri, owned by Saruman and Denethor, are among their most prized possessions, and were probably going to be worth fighting over. Whereas orcs are more simple creatures compared to men and wizards. Maybe a shiny shirt, or the suspiciously short orcs could be valuable. If only they knew what one was carrying. Value to your faction could come in the form of information. A book, perhaps. The red one written by Bilbo, Frodo, and finally Sam. Maybe the Chronicles of the failed Moria expedition. Or a map would help your army. Statues honouring past deeds and heroes are easy to make, simple to paint, and could even be a good way to cut down on the pile of shame that every hobbyist has. However, my Angmar army doesn't covet statues. It would much rather corrupt things that are living. These paralysed hobbits are perfect for objective marking. They represent a memorable part of the books, and a key function of the Angmar army itself, that being the paralysed rule for the Barrow-wights. And this is a good way to get some use out of models that would never see the light of day, other than the very specific scenario that they were created for. Moving on from the spooky lads now, several factions will value riches more than others. So perhaps jewels and coins could be worth fighting over? There's a whole load of treasure tokens for games like Frostgrave that could be great for Lake Town, the booty of the Corsairs of Umbar, or the treasure hoards of Erebor. Whereas other, more humble factions might value food above all else. An objective marker could be this lad's massive pumpkins. Some bees and honey for our bear friends? Or maybe even a plate of tomatoes? Actually, yeah, scrap that. Dark denizens of Mirkwood or Cirith Ungol players might want to pack a lunch for their spider friends. Some humanoids jabbed with the old stinger and wrapped up like a taco for later could make a great prize to be fighting over. Moving on from valuable things to the more vulnerable now. Another question could be, what would be worth saving for your faction? Inspired by Bard's parental instinct, you could separate the young of the cave drake into their own individual bases. Things like spider eggs, warg pups, or maybe some bird's nests for the great eagles. I'm sure all of them would react very violently to people trying to harm their young. Vulnerable people could just be everyday strangers caught in the crossfire. Here are my Erebor dwarf civilians. They are styled on the civilians pouring out of Erebor during the prologue of The Hobbit. 3 I picked up from HVM Workbench, and the remaining 2, the miner and the musician, I converted myself using dwarf scouts. Although it's worth noting here that, speaking from experience, this can lead to confusion on the tabletop. As they're similar to your own troops in stature, as well as the base, from the top down it can be difficult to distinguish them from Erebor troops. But I really love the look of these guys, and it is something you do get used to as you keep playing. In the same vein as the Erebor civilians, objective markers could be a simple slice of life that represents your faction. The ominous foreboding of this kite at the start of The Hobbit really had me thinking, what are the chances that this day of all days, Smaug shows up? The imagery really stuck with me, so I decided to make one for my Dale faction. To get this effect, I used a Saxon windsock in the shape of a dragon. There are loads of historical games like Saga that have these fairly regularly. All I had to do then was attach him to a 25mm base with a flight stand to make it look like he was flying in the wind. This is one of those objective marker projects though that are unfinished. I would really like to make the other 2 kites that are shown in the film, the crane and the turtle, and to round it out to the 6 I would need, I had an idea to use some of the animals seen on the Dale carousel, but I need to find time to make them. The last question to bear in mind when making objective markers could be what motivates your army or their leaders, and really shapes the way they behave. Ask yourself, what would make this faction go to war? Take the Arkenstone, or the Elven Gems for instance. Objective markers could be a 25mm scene. They could show a regrettable past, like the possessed Theoden, too weak to grasp his own sword, a broken horn, or maybe the flowers that grow on the grave of a prince. So these are just a few of the ideas I've had regarding objective markers. One of the reasons why making objective markers is so interesting is there's no right or wrong way to do it. I would love to hear your ideas, however, the ones you've had or implemented, in the comments below. If I get enough responses, I would really like to showcase them in a video. Please like and subscribe for more content like this. We've got loads of terrain builds, conversion and proxy guides for Middle-earth SPG. Let us know what you think of the format. It's just a ramble about the hobby and to start a discussion. If there's any more topics you'd like to see in a video, let me know in the comments. Anyway, thanks for watching. Catch you in the next one. See you later.